Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Shirk. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to my conversation with Steve Myers and Chris Buckley, two highly respected veteran journalists with the New York Times, who recently have been kicked out of China by the Chinese government in a series of tit-for-tat retaliatory moves by the Chinese government and by the US government over access by journalists to their respective countries. So Steve Myers is the bureau chief of the Beijing Bureau, the China Bureau, and I think we'll start with him. The two of you have been reporting from China and on China in a, okay. Hi, everybody. I'm not sure whether or not you heard my introduction, but I'm Susan Shirk. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this conversation with Chris Buckley and Steve Myers, highly respected veteran journalists who have been reporting from China for the New York Times. Chris Buckley actually has been reporting for 24 years. Steve Myers also did a lot of reporting from Moscow and from Iraq and was in China for 3 years. The two of them were, along with other American journalists who work for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, were asked to leave China by the Chinese government in a series of tit-for-tat moves by the Chinese and American government over the access of journalists to their respective countries. So today we have a great opportunity to talk with them. They are continuing to cover China, but just not in China. And we want to talk with them about their experience covering China during the Xi Jinping era, especially during the period of COVID, and then talk a little bit about why journalists have become caught up in this back and forth as US-China relations have deteriorated, and what the future will be for American journalism reporting on China. So let's start talking about your experience. First of all, just thanks so much for taking time out to be with us today. And tell us a little bit about your experience reporting from China over the past couple of years. Were you able to travel everywhere? And you know, what were some of the most important and interesting trips that you took, and what did you learn there about how China really works under Xi Jinping? Why don't you get us started, Steve? You're the bureau chief.
Thank you. It's great to be with you this morning. You asked a lot of questions there to start with. And one of the things I guess I would say is that even in the 3 years that I was there, we noticed a significant change in the reporting environment. And, you know, officially, we are allowed to travel anywhere freely in China, except Tibet. We're prohibited from going there as American journalists. But for the most part, you can get on a plane and go anywhere, including Xinjiang, which Chris and I did last August. But then the issue is, how free are you to actually report from the ground? And in the 3 years that I was there, I was detained 3 times by local police and prohibited from doing work. And this is not an uncommon experience for reporters. You show up in some place and you're immediately met by the local security or local police, and that will often involve many hours. In one case where I was in Sichuan near Tibet, well, actually in a Tibetan part of the province, we were driven back to the airport and put on a plane to Beijing. So they will make efforts, and this is especially true in Xinjiang, which Chris can talk about more, to block your reporting. It can be a hassle, obviously, when they stop you. But one of the things we've noticed even in the last few months is, a greater degree of suspicion of the motives of foreign journalists, even anger towards journalists, people not wanting to speak freely or openly anymore. The kinds of people that we would routinely call in the past, experts like yourself that we would call from various universities are now saying that they're unwilling to talk. It's not a good idea to speak to the media. One of our colleagues is working on a very sweet story about some elderly women who've started a dancing troupe, and they asked for permission from the local authorities for a photographer to come and take pictures, and they were told that was not a good idea because the New York Times is banned in China. So that kind of thing is really getting in the way of what even the Chinese officials that we talked to, at least until recently, would tell you. We want you, the foreign media, to show the whole breadth of China and Chinese society. And we try to do that. And I think we actually have succeeded in doing that. But now even their own restrictions are getting in the way of that sort of thing.
So tell us a little bit about reporting from Xinjiang. Is this a photograph from Xinjiang?
Yes, this was a trip that I went with Chris in August for a week in Kashgar, Hotan, Yarkand, and I can let Chris talk more about it as well. He's more of the expert on the region than I am, but it was an instance also where we were dogged from the moment we got off the plane by secret police who followed us literally everywhere we went, sat next to us while we were eating. This picture is, they blocked the road, I guess creatively, that suddenly we couldn't drive down that road anymore because it was towards a religious site that there's reports has been damaged, and they didn't want us to go there. Another time there was a group of street workers, street sweepers, suddenly appeared on the road and blocked our way. Again, this is routine. Every reporter who's gone to Xinjiang has had to deal with things like this because they're obviously very sensitive about controlling the information that comes from that region. And maybe Chris can talk about this interview here.
Yeah, it looks like you took the photograph of Chris, who's doing an interview. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on here, Chris?
This was an interview that was arranged for us by the local authorities in Hotan after they'd realized we'd arrived, in which they arranged for us to meet a man who said he'd gone through a re-education camp and come through the experience transformed. You can see him sitting directly opposite me there, and in the middle is a local official who accompanied us. It was a surreal experience because there were so many gaps in his story, and by the end of the interview it wasn't even clear to us that this was his own house, although that's how it had been presented to us. Even so, he told us a story about having I think from memory, Steve, he said he'd had some video content on his cell phone that showed he'd had dangerous proclivities and therefore signed up for a re-education program and had come through it transformed and renouncing his previous ideas and having a much more enlightened attitude toward the world. So this was one of the rare instances in Xinjiang where the local authorities organized access for us, such as it is. Most of the reporting that we do in Xinjiang involves essentially no interviews at all. And the reason for that is because we're being followed all the time. Even on this most recent trip last year, the fear is that anybody we try to talk to, we'll get them into trouble. So I've found in my recent trips to Xinjiang over the past 2 or 3 years that the essential purpose is not to interview people as valuable and tempting as that experience would be, but simply to get an experience about what life is like there for residents, how things are changing, how the economy is operating, how the security system is operating. So in some ways, I liken it to being an anthropologist who is there as an observer, rather as a journalist who is trying to hail people down on the street and get them to talk. It's very rare that you get those opportunities in Xinjiang to speak to people candidly.
One thing I would say also about that interview is that I think that they actually meant it to be an interview with somebody who was working in a new factory and living in this village alongside Han Chinese. It was called New Unity Village. And I don't think they wanted the conversation to go into his time in the camps, his re-education, as it were, because they tried to block that interview the minute he mentioned it. And when we asked questions, trying to follow up on what his experience was like, it became very uncomfortable. And, you know, when the minders are sitting in the interview like that, it can be difficult. But in this case, we were able to persist and, you know, I think got a little bit of a glimpse of what was happening with these camps, which was a tremendous experience to have.
So you're not able to speak with shopkeepers or any ordinary people when you're there? I mean, that is quite different than being an anthropologist. It's,
True.
you know, I'm not sure. I mean, it's fascinating that you were able to learn as much as you could. But you also did get some amazing documents, Chris, that revealed some of the internal decision-making on the camps. And, you know, that gave us a really unusual insight into what was going on. But those opportunities are few and far between, I'm sure.
Well, that particular story about the documents about policymaking in Xinjiang, in a sense, also exemplifies how a lot of the reporting has been done out there, not just by the New York Times, but certainly by other news organizations as well, such as Associated Press, the Washington Post, and so on, which is, you know, in the absence of opportunities to speak candidly to people on the ground out there and to interview officials directly, we're increasingly reliant on what documents can tell us, documents found online, in this case, documents from a particular source, but nonetheless, building up a record and understanding about what's been happening in the region, not just from interviews, but from a careful parsing of what you find, you know, often online from the government's own reports.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a general pattern that we're going to find increasingly in reporting on Chinese politics in general. You know, that the New York Times now is, you know, we only have a couple of reporters who are entitled to report within China. And the absence of being on the ground there, I think we'll find that we have to be more creative. And like a lot of other news organizations, we'll have to use other resources to try to understand government decision-making, not just about Xinjiang, but about other topics as well, the economy, Hong Kong, and so on.
So, Chris, you were in Wuhan during COVID. So why don't you tell us a little bit that was like, what that was like. I mean, were you able to interview people then? Of course, you had to be very careful for your own safety, but you know, how was the situation basically the same as Xinjiang or very different?
Very, very different, actually. So I went to Wuhan on January 23, the day in which the city announced a lockdown that would prevent residents from leaving. And I went there thinking I'd be there for a week or two until the government got the situation under control and life returned to a kind of normal. I never imagined I would be there for 2.5 months. And I must say, I never imagined that it was going to turn into this terrible global pandemic. But as a reporting experience, it was, above all else, a great privilege. And part of the privilege was that it was a time when people across China, and especially in Wuhan, felt extremely outspoken about what they were experiencing, were very generous about sharing their experiences and their information, and also had an intense hunger for more information as well. So Steve was talking about, you know, the general trend we've seen over the past 7 or 8 years of increasing tightening of information, increasing censorship, and increasing sensitivity about foreign journalists in China. That's all true, but I did find in Wuhan that all of those trends were in a sense on hold for a while, despite COVID-19, in the sense that once you got over people's initial surprise when you approached them on the street to ask them, you know, about what they were going through, about what their families were living, once they understood that you were a journalist, even a foreign journalist, almost invariably they were very generous about sharing their time, while of course observing social distancing on the street or, you know, outside a hospital or somewhere like that. So I think that was a time when we saw a glimpse of another China as well. You know, a time when people are also hungry for information and also more forthcoming about the flux of emotions and opinions that they were going through at that time. I think even since then, even in the few months since that time, China has become a tighter place again. It's become harder to do that kind of reporting. But certainly for the weeks in Xinjiang, in Wuhan, when I was permitted to do reporting, it was a really amazing experience. And I'll look back on that time with a great deal of fondness.
So what is this a photograph of people checking into a hospital or emergency room, or is it, what is it that we're looking
I should emphasize this was a photo not taken from the room in the hospital, but from a window outside. So this is people who are lining up to get their test results after doing CT scans and other tests to see if they might have the coronavirus. So that was a time, I think this was in late January, when hospitals there were overwhelmed with patients, worried that they might have the virus, trying to confirm whether they did or not. And the hospitals that were assigned to give tests for patients were virtually overwhelmed. As we've seen across the world since then, it's been an experience that many other countries have experienced, this surge of demand for medical care.
And so these people in the suits here are ordinary citizens, or are these medical workers, or?
No, this is a young couple who I encountered on the bridge across the Yangtze River in Wuhan, who essentially adopted this as their daily wear and daily fashion. So they would put on these suits whenever they left their homes. I should emphasize this photo was taken in the weeks when the lockdown in Wuhan was a lockdown, but people still had some permission to leave their homes. What you saw going into February was that it became essentially impossible for all but a very few people to leave their homes, even for shopping. So this was a time when it was still possible to go out and do your own shopping and even go for a stroll. That time disappeared for many weeks from February onward.
So, you know, at the very beginning of the epidemic in Wuhan, there was this outpouring of anger and fear when they learned about the risk, and they felt that they had not been told all the information. There'd been a suppression of information by the censors and security. And, you know, did you get that directly in interviews with people? And are you surprised at how the mood has changed so quickly in China from that moment to this more rally around the flag, positive view of the central government anyway for getting control over COVID?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, it was, you would walk up to almost anybody randomly in Wuhan and they'd be willing to talk about what they were going through. I remember a couple of experiences in which I was visiting hospitals to get a look from outside, and I encountered a few city government officials who I expected to be quite cautious about talking to me, and they certainly didn't want to talk on the record. But even they were incensed at how the government had mishandled the outbreak early on. You know, these were city government officials, not in the health sector, I should emphasize, but from other parts of government who you know, even though they were loyal government officials and party members, felt a sense of betrayal that the government had, in their eyes, hidden crucial information from the public early on, had let the virus slip out of control, so that now Wuhan had become a paralyzed, besieged city. And you heard that from a lot of people. The other thing, though, that I often found in Wuhan during those early weeks is that people also had a flux of emotions. And what I mean by that is, at the same time as expressing anger with the government, there was also a strong sense among many people I spoke to that nonetheless, we have to work alongside the government now to get through this very dangerous time. And sometimes people would be quite explicit about it, that yes, we do want a reckoning with the officials who we believe, especially the city and province officials, who we believe hid this from us. Nonetheless, now is not the time for a reckoning. Let's just get through this first, and then we can demand a reckoning. Now, we've moved on since then to, I think, as you were saying, Susan, the Chinese government has pretty effectively shifted the official narrative from one in which it's seen as, you know, the focus has shifted from the government's perceived, you know, missteps and failings and coverings up, to one in which the government is telling the public that, in fact, this is a period of vindication, especially for the central leadership in Xi Jinping, showing that they're able to muster the resources of the Communist Party to overcome this very dangerous epidemic at a time when developed Western countries, including the United States, are floundering in their solutions. And that's a message that has some pull for Chinese people.
Yeah.
I would go back to that other word I used before, though, which is a flux of emotions. You know, in my years of reporting in China, I've sort of given up on the idea that people in China or in any society have a very cohesive, unified view of politics or political life that means that you're either for the government or against it, that you're either a loyal follower of Xi Jinping or you're an opponent. Many Chinese people live through all sorts of conflicting situations and conflicting emotions in which they accept certain parts of the system, even as they complain and resist other parts of it. So I think even now in this period when there's a very triumphant message coming from China, at least my experience in the weeks before leaving China is that even people who thought along those lines and did feel that China had much to be proud of about overcoming the epidemic, were also critical about what the government had done, especially early on. I don't think those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah. So, Steve, tell us what life was like in Beijing for you during the epidemic. And in particular, one aspect of the way that the Chinese government and Communist Party have been so successful at controlling the spread of the epidemic. It's not just policing and repression and strict social controls. It's also what you might call social policing by ordinary people, neighborhood committees, and the leaders of these neighborhood committees in various communities. Did you find in your community where you lived, that same kind of active role by ordinary Chinese, or are you living in an expat community where you didn't have that?
It's a really good question, because if you remember, this all began right before the New Year's holiday.
Right.
So in Beijing, at least, it felt like the holiday just went on a little longer. Everything was closed except for supermarkets, which stayed open. And it felt like, the city just got quiet. And instead of that lasting 2 or 3 days, it lasted 2 or 3 weeks. And so the beginning of it was surreal in how quiet the place seemed, the city. I mean, it's a huge bustling city, as anyone who's been there knows. But then as time went on, in fact, the restrictions increased. And so at first we could more or less go freely. No one was required to stay home or quarantine or self-isolate. But people did. People just largely stayed away from public spaces. The metro was empty, that sort of thing. But as time went on, they began to impose restrictions, for example, on taking temperatures when you entered buildings. I think socially everyone wore a mask anyway for their own safety. And then even as the epidemic really peaked, the restrictions got tighter and tighter, so that they started limiting travel coming in and out of the city. They were requiring people who had been in harder hit areas to undergo quarantines. And a lot of this was done, as you were pointing out, by your local committee. So in my building, I didn't live in an expat area. And the first thing they did was close all the extra gates around the apartment complex. So you could only come in one gate. So they would that in some way control things. And then we had to sign up for cards that, essentially registered us. And then we had, police would come by and check, especially on foreigners, especially those from who had been to Italy, for example, as I had been in January. And they wanted to know exactly when I was in Italy, when I was in Austria in the weeks before all this happened. So it was a mixture of the local community, the apartment building, but also the working with the local police districts. And, especially as Beijing began to reopen, as the country began to reopen, they became much more paranoid, I think, about protecting the political leadership. They really wanted to keep the virus out of the capital if they could. And they've largely succeeded in doing that. They will tell you, the party, as Chris was mentioning, that they've done a great job in controlling this by monitoring people, testing, and restricting movement of people that are suspected of having the coronavirus. And, they will tell you that they have a lesson they can share with the rest of the world. They've repeat that message. They've offered help to other countries. It's not that I'm sitting now in South Korea, which has also done a tremendous job in controlling the virus in a very different political system. So it's not something I think that's exclusive to the Communist Party leadership, that they have some secret recipe for handling a crisis like this, because other countries have proven that they can as well. But it was effective. To answer your question, in stopping the spread.
If I could add something on that, Susan.
Sure.
Just from the experience in Wuhan, when I hopped on the train to Wuhan, trying to digest the notion of a city of over 11 million people being locked down, I imagined that it would require massive mobilization of security forces. So I imagined lines of police on the street, the People's Armed Police mobilized to enforce the lockdown and so on. When I arrived that first day, there were very few security forces around. You know, there were some police, but I wouldn't say any more than normal.
Doesn't look like Xinjiang.
No, not at all. And I think one of the things that you did see in Wuhan, just to redouble on what Steve was talking about, was the mobilization of the local party apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
So not just social policing as such, but what we did see come forward there, come to the fore, was the importance of local party organizations across Wuhan, and then I think across China as well. Residential party committees, party officials being sent from city party apparatus offices down into the grassroots to mobilize this effort. First of all, to monitor people's comings and goings, to organize logistics supplies so that residents receive food without going to supermarkets. It didn't always work well, but what we did see is this mobilizational state that Xi Jinping has strengthened over the past few years come forward to provide, a lot of the controls and logistical support that was needed to lock down the population. And that's one lesson I did come back from Wuhan, is the enduring importance of the local party apparatus in China. After many years when we've talked about the disappearance of the work unit and perhaps the erosion of local party units, what we did see, at least in Wuhan for that period, was the resurgence of the importance of those institutions.
And in a positive way, whereas I think previously with things like one-child family and other kind of intrusions into people's private lives, they thought these people were kind of bossy and not, they didn't want the intrusion, but now they were actually helping support people and protect people. So the party has been strengthened, and it had this positive value, utility during this kind of crisis.
Plenty of residents had their complaints about how these local officials operated, but often it was because of their missteps, failing to provide food deliveries, for example. So in that sense, it was a time when we did see the party organization strengthened.
No, I would also say that if you compare it to the United States, where there are people who are angrily disputing even the notion of wearing a mask, you saw, I think, a unity of purpose among people, at least in Beijing and other parts of China, where people took it seriously. They understood this was inconvenient in many ways for them, and obviously, especially so in harder hit places like Wuhan. But people trusted, I think, to a certain extent, that the government was doing the right thing, and that even if this was annoying, even if they had complaints about the way things were handled, and there was an outpouring of anger over the doctor who had been punished, but people understood that this was a crisis, a public health crisis, and were willing to go along with that in a way that you don't see in the United States right now. Or at least you see divisions over it, debates over it. Whether or not it's appropriate. You didn't have that in China.
So we have a lot of great questions coming in that I really want to turn to, but before I do want to ask you about getting kicked out of China. The Chinese government, my understanding is, they said this was purely a reciprocal move to actions the United States had taken to require Chinese journalists to register as foreign representatives of a foreign government, and then to put some restrictions on the numbers. I believe that there, at one time anyway, were, say, more than 250 Chinese journalists in the United States. I think maybe that number is now reduced. I'd be interested in what you could tell us about that. So, I must say, when the US government did this, I was sort of puzzled because, of course, the Wall Street Journal, their journalists had their visas revoked because of a op-ed piece, headline of an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal that talked about China as the sick man of Asia. I believe the Chinese government said that this was just in retaliation for US government moves. But do you think that they really did it because they've been looking for the opportunity to get rid of these American journalists who they believe are telling their readers too much of sort of the underside of the Chinese system? I mean, that they've just been looking for an excuse. I mean, Steve, what do you think?
If I could just quickly go through the history a little bit, it's
Sure,
the Chinese have a lot of journalists that operate in the U.S. There are hundreds of them, and they have largely operated freely there. And over the years, and especially even before this administration, there were some concerns about the activities of some of those journalists, how many were truly operating the way we operate as journalists versus doing party reports or even more active intelligence work. And the administration was moving against that and going back for a few months before all of this happened. And then it was when the Chinese kicked out 3 of our colleagues from the Wall Street Journal over that op-ed headline that they announced they were going to cap the number of journalists from 5 Chinese state media organizations. And that effectively kicked out, I think, about 60 Chinese journalists, or at least ended their time there. And so they can argue that they were retaliating. The U.S. would say that though they didn't directly link it to the Wall Street Journal expulsions, that was certainly a trigger, I know. Mm-hmm. And so who started this tit for tat is a little bit open for interpretation. But it's clear that after the U.S. announced its move, that they targeted 5 American news organizations, and they tried to do the 5 because they wanted it to be reciprocal. Though they also touched Time magazine, which had no American journalists, working in China at the moment, and VOA. But it really affected the 3 newspapers, us, the Journal and the Washington Post. And I think, to answer your question, that there was some deliberation in that. I mean, it wasn't an accident that they chose us. There are other American organizations that were not touched. And I don't want to single them out, but they were clearly going after what they considered the most critical voices. Not that we're critics of the government, but that our coverage is thorough and often is seen as critical. Chris's situation is slightly different because, not being an American, he was not part of this expulsion, but had his visa not renewed. And was asked to leave accordingly. And so, it's had an impact that really landed hardest, I think, on the most, if I may say, authoritative voices from the American media there. And unfortunately, I mean, as a journalist, I can say, I think, without being political about it, that I regret any restrictions on journalists anywhere. And obviously, the Chinese doing this to us is not welcome. And I think it will hurt China. It will hurt our understanding of China. And to our paper's credit, they're really committed to keeping us working on China. And it's a bit like the old days when we used to cover it from afar. Correspondents were based in Hong Kong, peering over the border, as it were, talking to sources and so forth. The Times still has 2 journalists accredited in the mainland. We still have our Hong Kong office, and we still have our Chinese researchers who are on the ground. And so we're going to keep doing our coverage as best we can, despite these restrictions, which I hope both sides will reconsider at some point.
Okay, so that last question, how do you think we should stabilize this situation over journalists' access. You know, I've been working with Orville Schell on a task force on US policy toward China, Asia Society and 21st Century China Center effort. We've convened a little group and we're looking at the how it was managed during the US-Soviet Cold War, which was strict reciprocity in numbers. And it apparently worked very well, so that if the Russians expelled a journalist because they didn't like what he said or claimed he was a spy, then the United States expelled a journalist. And the result was it didn't become a front in the Cold War. And both countries did have a limited number of journalists covering one another's country. So why not do it that way? Chris, do you have a view about that?
I have to say, to put it simply, Susan, I don't have a strong view about it. I sort of mentally recuse myself from offering prescriptions for governments. And I find it very difficult to sort of craft an answer in which I can tell you what either side should be doing. I do think ultimately that it's very true that there may be parallels with the Soviet Union, but China these days is not the Soviet Union. I think the way it would respond to any tit for tat is probably different. I also think that ultimately, you know, whatever solution is arrived at when it comes to access for foreign media outlets in China, it's also going to depend in the background on just the general political and social environment in China. At a time of increasing tightening of information and opinion within China, I think the fact is that under those conditions, it's unlikely the Chinese government is going to make major concessions on access by foreign journalists. That's an evasive answer, I'm afraid, but I really can't think of any easy solutions to this problem.
What about you, Steve? Do you have any views on this?
I would say it's an incredibly different media environment today than it was in Soviet times, where mainstream journalists, newspapers, and television reporters were really the only way information could be conveyed, and it was done in a much slower way. And you know, again, I'll say what I did before, which is I don't think any government should restrict the work of journalists anywhere. And the fact is that China has been, it always has. And while there was this, I think, a thaw is maybe to use another Cold War word. There was a thaw for a number of years leading up to and after the Olympics in 2008. And what's interesting is you have the Olympics coming up again.
Yeah, I have a question about that here.
And yet you don't see the same sort of openness that China feels that it needed to show in 2008. And I was covering the White House back then, and I came with President Bush for the Olympics, which were really a success for the country. And they wanted to put a good face out there, I think, for the world, to show that it was a modern society and so forth. And, you know, now they're coming up on another Olympic season where there are going to be a lot of calls for political change inside China, a lot of attention placed on it. And you're in a situation where they're treating foreign journalists with open hostility right now. And, you know, obviously, you know, again, I'm like Chris, I don't really advise governments, but but I will say that I think that they should be more open to foreign coverage of the country. I think that it's not as hostile as they think it is. And you know, I would say the same about the US government.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if maybe the Olympic Committee could create some pressure on the Chinese government about foreign journalists.
I think that the record of the Olympic Committee would suggest that that's not very likely.
Okay. Well, I have a lot of really good questions here, and I'm trying to figure out which ones to ask you. Um, so have, can Chinese citizens read any Western publications? Say something about the New York Times in China and whether or not the Chinese edition to the New York Times, is there any way for Chinese citizens to read it? And is it going to continue, even though I'm sure it's a very costly operation?
You know, the New York Times website, both the English and the Chinese sites are blocked inside the Great Firewall. And so for people to read it, they have to go outside. And what's quite common in China, as many of you know, is the use of VPNs that allow you to essentially disguise your location. And yes, there are a lot of people who still read it. I mean, the government reads our coverage every day, of course, and they're now all on Twitter, even though Twitter is banned also inside of China. You have spokespeople for the foreign ministry, you know, engaging with the public on that platform. So yes, people get it. How extensively, you know, it's hard to know. I mean, there are some, you know, people who trace that, you know, but given the use of VPNs, we don't always know where people are reading from. I mean, my VPN could be set in Australia, even though I'm sitting in China reading the Times. You know, I read the Times every day, of course, you know, through the VPN as my habit that I've had for years of reading it first thing in the morning. So, so yeah, people are aware of it. How much they digest is, of course, harder to know. And I can tell you a great story after the column in the Wall Street Journal. A photographer I know who was on assignment with the Wall Street Journal was out in a park and taking people. This was during the pandemic, of course, but it was about how people were starting to go back out in life, and took a picture of a woman exercising in Deaton Park. And the woman then asked, "Oh, where are you from?" And the minute they said the Wall Street Journal, she just went into a rage, ranting at them about this terrible column, which I'm pretty sure she hadn't read. But it's possible that she had, but she certainly knew the coverage of that column because the Chinese media really roasted the journal for it. So, you know, it's you know, the foreign media, people know the New York Times. When you meet people on the street, they've heard of it. And, you know, it's so there's some penetration, definitely.
The only other thing I'd add to Steve's answer is never forget the extraordinary reach and potency of WeChat in China, this social media platform that virtually every Chinese adult now joins.
Mhm.
And it's possible, despite censorship, that stories from the New York Times and other banned media outlets can circulate on WeChat. People use PDF files or, you know, other means in which to circulate news. So when people are intensely interested in a story, whether it's you know, a COVID-19 outbreak or Chinese politics or something like that, you will find that people, certainly more educated people in cities, will often have access to information despite the firewall. Now, how they respond to that information and reporting is a very different matter. For example, I don't think every Chinese, let me put it differently, I think even Chinese people who have read the coverage of Xinjiang and the mass detentions out there in the Times and other media outlets don't necessarily oppose the Chinese government's policies. They can respond in their own very different ways to the reporting that they get from overseas outlets.
So do you think the New York Times is kind of particularly in the doghouse with the folks in Beijing because of the exposés? This is one of the questions somebody asked, because of the expose of Wen Jiabao's family, former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao's family's corruption. That story in particular, which won a Pulitzer Prize, I believe, for David Barbosa, who was then the lead reporter with the New York Times working on that. I'm sure you were involved in that too. But no, but you know, so do you think the New York Times is a particular bête noire of the Chinese government because of these stories about high-level elite politics and corruption?
You know, I would say that the New York Times is always in the doghouse with the Chinese government, and always has been and always will be. But I would add, though, that it's a bit like President Trump's love-hate relationship with the New York Times. I mean, on one level, they see validation in it, in the coverage. I wrote a story about one of their sci-fi films that came out, a big blockbuster, sort of big budget science fiction film, which was, you know, not bad. And I wrote a story just simply describing it and how I used the phrase the coming of age of sci-fi in China, which was quoted in state media because they saw that as like a positive story. And I think that's partly what they're going to miss by limiting the coverage from the outside. I mean, on one level, they like the recognition and they understand the importance to the English-speaking audience. I was going to say American, but our reach is much more international now. And, you know, it's an important platform. And that's true with the other papers as well that they've targeted. So, I mean, on one level, I'll go back to what I said. They will argue that this was not targeting us per se, that it was just reciprocal against the, you know, American moves on Chinese media. But, you know, there I think was some relish they took in ousting the reporters they did.
So do you think this is it forever? Do you think there's a way to get New York Times journalists back to China without, you know, some fundamental change in the Chinese leadership or system?
Or you could say also in the American leadership or system. Okay. I think, I mean, yeah. I don't want to be pessimistic because generally I'm an optimistic person. So I would love to think that there's some cooler heads will prevail and they'll let the journalists who were expelled back in, or if not us, then others will be able to come back in at some point when relations improve. I mean, we're in a downward spiral right now that's much bigger than just the treatment of journalists. And so I think we're caught up in that in some regards. And maybe a change in that will have an effect for the journalists on both sides.
So I have a question here about what we still don't really know about the COVID epidemic in China. Not just the origin stories and, you know, the actual origin and what happened in Wuhan, but also about the statistics throughout China. So what kind of, one participant asked here, what kind of information do you wish you had or would you like to get to find out more about COVID in China?
Let me have a go at answering some of that question.
Okay.
It's what we've seen with the COVID-19 outbreak is how different parties and different governments have been constructing their own narratives about what happened, even while the outbreak is happening. And, you know, part of our job as journalists is to try to untangle what the truth is, what the facts are underneath those narratives. And especially with China, you know, there are two big issues from early in the outbreak that I wish we could understand more of. One of them is the train of decision making and information flows that developed as the outbreak emerged from late 2019. Mm-hmm. We do know that the central leadership under Xi Jinping was paying attention to this outbreak from early January, but we don't know a great deal about what Xi Jinping and other leaders were actually saying early in January. And I don't think we still have a very good understanding about what judgments and what information they had about crucial questions about the outbreak back then, such as, for example, the degree to which this then little understood coronavirus was easily transmissible from one human being to another. So that's one area of information I think that, I do hope that more will come out about it. I think the other thing to remember is that, despite all the politics, despite all the storm of controversy at the moment, scientists are still going about their work on looking at the origins of the outbreak, looking at how it jumped from animals, perhaps originally bats, and eventually into human beings. And I've just been, over the past few days, beginning to go back looking at some of the research coming out. And there's quite a lot of interesting material coming out. So we shouldn't lose hope that there's going to be nothing new coming out about the early phase of this epidemic. I do think it requires persistent and careful reporting, but I do hope it's going to be possible to have a clearer understanding about how this virus emerged, and hopefully something about how the Chinese government handled it early on.
Were you surprised or not surprised that there was so little cooperation between the US and China on the epidemic, certainly compared to previous epidemics? Steve, Chris?
I think,
Steve?
the Chinese government will say, and they've repeated this, that they spoke with the head of the CDC in early January, and that they shared information with the United States all along or through the WHO. I think that what's happened, obviously I think they could have shared more. Some people in the WHO have raised concerns, the Europeans have raised concerns. It's not just a US-China issue, that they weren't entirely forthcoming with the rest of the world, as they weren't entirely forthcoming, as Chris mentioned, internally. And that's one of the big mysteries that I think we're going to learn more about in the weeks and months to come. But on one level, there's a story in our paper today about how they're cooperating on a scientific level, to research the origins of the coronavirus beginning in bats. I just think that it became such a political issue in the United States once things went so bad there, that US officials, I think, closed the door to a lot of potential cooperation, which the Chinese say they want to do now, that the world should unite and work together on combating this through the WHO and things. They're very sensitive, obviously, about the origins and the missteps in the beginning. So they've resisted the notion of an international investigation, but they've also opened the door at least to a token one, at least from the WHO or through the WHO. So I think that there's blame on both sides for there not being more cooperation.
Yes, well, it's become a very sensitive issue in China politically, I understand. I mean, they talk a lot about unifying our thinking on the whole narrative of what happened. And it suggests to me some real anxiety and insecurity about having people have different views, maybe coming from the early days when the people of Wuhan and Hebei were really up in arms. So, or maybe some elite differences, which of course, we're always interested to try to eke out and see if there are differences at the top level. So this is the sort of thing that we could talk about for a long, long time. But I want to thank you so much for talking with us, and thanks for all your great work in helping us understand China, that it's not a monolith, that there are a lot of different groups, a lot of people. It's a more complex and pluralistic system than is often the way it's viewed outside. And I think that's really, really important. And I hope that you'll continue to get at that nuance and texture, even though you're not on the ground in China. And hopefully, I still favor the reciprocal approach. And I think it could work if we had a negotiation and had the same number of journalists in the two countries. So I'm hoping that Americans reporting on the New York Times will be back in China, as well as Australians, Chris,
Yes,
back
please.
in China soon. So thanks from all the participants in the call, and we
Thank you.
really enjoyed hearing from you. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you very
Pleasure.
much.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.